Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific campaign was gathering steam as 1943 came to an end. After capturing the Gilbert Islands in November, his men now turned their attention to the Marshall Islands as the next stop on their arduous journey to Tokyo. The plan, known as Operation Flintlock, was for Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's V amphibious force to attack Kwajalein Atoll in the center of the archipelago directly, eluding the Marshall's more formidable outer defenses. General Holland M. Mage, General Harry Schmidt's untested 4th Marine Division, sailing straight from San Diego, would capture Roi-Namur and its first-rate airfield, 44 miles to the north, while Howland Mad Smith, USMC, commander of V Amphibious Corps, chose the Army's seasoned 7th Infantry Division to secure naval facilities at Kwajalein Island in the atoll's southern. The 1,200 by 1,250-yard Roi is level and desolate, with hardly enough space for the airfield. Namur, which covered 800 by 900 yards of densely forested land that provided shade for the garrison's barracks and other buildings, was tethered to Roi by a 400-yard causeway and a thin sandspit that ran along the lagoon. Along with a 345-man presence of the 61st Guard Force and possibly 1,200 military members, the islands were seized by 35 aircraft and about 2,000 members of Japanese Vice Admiral Michiyuki Yamada's 24th Air Flotilla. In preparation for an oceanside landing, Roi-Namur was defended by 2 batteries of twin-mounted 127mm guns, 4 37mm cannons, 19 13.2 mm heavy machine guns, and 10 20mm anti-aircraft weapons, almost all pointing north. There were 52 pillboxes and 8 blockhouses scattered across the terrain, along with general-purpose machine guns. The beaches were surrounded by battle trenches and anti-tank ditches. On January 29, 1944, Rear Admiral Richard Connolly's Task Force 53 closed in to begin a huge 3-day bombardment. After a 2-month bombing campaign, the defenders were hit by over 2,655 tons of high explosives. 3,178 Marines were killed in the Navy's dreadfully insufficient 21 to 2-hour preliminary barrage at Tarawa in November 1943. Admiral Connolly was determined to demolish all the buildings, trees, and people that occupied Roi-Namur. On D-Day, January 31st, the 25th Marines captured the first targets, 5 offshore islands, with minimal difficulty. After securing these, the 14th Marines howitzers were positioned to assist with the major invasion that was planned for the next morning. Getting ready for the lagoon assault. All night long, the U.S. shell after shell was fired at the unfortunate islets by Navy gunners. In order to allow the lumbering Marine-carrying LSTs, land ships tank, to separate from the fleet and reach the lagoon, the cannonading stopped just before dawn on February 1st. After these were set up, the bombardment began again with full force. The Marines readied themselves for battle in the lagoon. Lieutenant Kohler's Edward Dillon's 2nd Battalion was to storm Red Beach 3, to Hammond's right, while Lieutenant Kohler of Hugh and Hammond's 1st Battalion was to enter Red Beach 2 with Colonel Louis Jones's 23rd Marines. The 24th Marines under Colonel Franklin Hart would attack Namur at the same time. To the right of the L-shaped Yokohama Pier, which acted as the battalion boundary, Hart selected Idolfus Cole. Austin Brunelli's 3rd Battalion to storm Green Beach 1, while Lieutenant Kohler Francis Brink's 2nd Battalion struck Green 2. The assault time, or W hour, was scheduled for 10 a.m. The infantry was separated into assault and boat teams, the latter consisting of a mix of machine gunners, demolition specialists, and bazooka troops, all of whom were deployed in LVT-2s, landing vehicle tracked. The former was composed of riflemen. In order to claw over barrier reefs, these amphibious tractors, also known as Amtraks, were equipped with cleated treads. Each could accommodate 18-24 men. The infantry would be preceded by 4 companies of armored LVT-As, or M tanks, armed with machine guns and turreted 37mm cannons. LCVPs, landing craft vehicle personnel, with flat bottoms would transport follow-up units. The 4th Amphibian Tractor Battalion would transport the assault waves of the 23rd Marines, and the 10th Battalion's Amtraks would transport the 24th Marines. After serving continuously the day before, transporting elements of the 25th Marines to the outlying islands, the 10th was in a state of chaos. Transporting people and supplies to and from the numerous islets had taken up a significant amount of the crew's fuel and almost all of their energy, making the experience a lengthy and difficult one. Many lost sight of their motherships as night fell. As a result, bilge pumps stopped operating when some LVTs ran out of gas. Some took sanctuary on neighboring beaches, while others perished and swamped in the rough waters. Only 62 of the 118 LVTs allotted for the Namur landings were operational by dawn. A last-minute change required Captain John Ross, Jr.'s Company E, originally Battalion Reserve, to switch roles with G Company because Captain Charles Berkeley, Jr.'s Company G, one of the scheduled assault companies for Brink's Landing Team 2, was unable to secure enough LVTs to make the landing as late as 6:30 a.m. Berkeley's troops would have to hold off on taking them in until enough ships could be gathered. Lieutenant Column Brunelli just combined all the Amtraks that were available until both assault companies had enough transportation, while his reserve force, Company L, remained on its LST without any means of embarking. Landing Team 3 was also beset by shortages. As the ad hoc attack waves fought to obtain the line of departure, chaos took the place of order. WR was therefore moved to 11 a.m. The Navy, meanwhile, adhered to a strict schedule. Rear Admiral Lawrence DeBose's fire support team, 2 tore off salvos at Roi at 6:50 a.m., while Rear Admiral Howard Kingman's Fire Support Unit 1 slipped to within 3,000 yards of Namur's oceanfront beaches to begin the last bombardment. The 14th Marines howitzers rang in from the nearby islets at the first sign of daybreak. By that time, the Japanese air fleet was completely destroyed, along with the command and communication system, which included Admiral Yamada and his staff, who were all killed in the debris. As all of this was going on, naval control officers who were responsible for lining up the 24th Marines waves were rather upset because unscheduled units were coming into view while assigned teams were nowhere to be seen. Another 15 minutes passed with little progress. It was anticipated that the LVTs circling impatiently in the lagoon would once more be put in danger due to needless fuel usage. In addition, there were still no adequate reserves for the original landing troops. Thankfully, Lieutenant Colonel Aquila Dias's 1st Battalion, the floating reserve, had already enlisted on LCVPs 3,000 yards behind the departure line. Companies A and B were instructed by Colonel Hart to cover the gap. However, as soon as these units reached the departure line, remnants of Company G appeared, loaded onto a mix of LVTs and LCVPs, intent on reclaiming their position as the reserve for Landing Team 2. As Company A gave up its position, wave officers were at their wits' end. It was 11:12 a.m. when the control ship dropped the red signal flag, which read, "Launch the invasion." The 23rd Marines landing craft raced toward their assigned beaches. Captured by surprise, the coxswains carrying the unkempt 24th fired their engines and headed for enemy coastlines 4,000 yards away. Reaching the shores. The armored LVT-As of the first wave followed closely behind the LCI-G gunboats, landing craft, infantry, which led the procession. As the assault waves proceeded on their way to their targets, the gunboats swung broadside and opened fire with rockets and fast-firing 40mm cannons 1,000 yards from shore. As dive bombers began their last sorties, the Navy's bombardment moved to the interior just in time. The 23rd Marines' 30 LVT-As arrived at Roi hot, waddling onshore and slicing through the dense battle cloud with streams of searing tracers. Just 60 feet from the surf, an intimidating anti-tank trench loomed as they barely touched down. With their machine guns and turreted cannons firing a raging barrage, the armored tractors, unable to continue inland, staggered to a standstill. The time was 11:33 a.m. 20 minutes later, the 23rd Marines LVTs clattered ashore. The Marines from Lieutenant Colonel Dillon's 2nd Battalion's Companies E and F struck Red Beach 3 in the right-hand sector, scrambled over a little incline, and then dropped to look fearfully into a wall of smoke and dust. The Japanese positions were in ruins, and naval artillery had destroyed almost every coastal pillbox. So, even though there was a lot of gunfire flashing overhead, not much looked to be getting in. Dillon's men proceeded quickly inland after crossing the ditch and shooting the few confused defenders they came across. Several light tanks from Company A had already crossed a part of the anti-tank trench that had collapsed and joined the attack shortly after the M4 Sherman medium tanks of Company C, 4th Tank Battalion, had arrived. About 200 yards inland, down the lower arm of the airstrip, the Marines arrived at the 01 phase line within 20 minutes of landing. Soon after, Company G beached and began identifying and eliminating any adversaries that had escaped. 5 minutes behind Dillon's soldiers, and with little resistance, Lieutenant Colonel Hammond's 1st Battalion landed on Red Beach 2 on the extreme left. Company A, under by Captain James Scales, swung to the left to attack 2 massive pillboxes that were reportedly located 300 yards away at Wendy Point. Where the strongholds were supposed to have stood, these Marines discovered nothing but burning, debris-filled craters, mute evidence of the Navy's overwhelming weaponry. Wendy Point, which was anticipated to be a difficult battle, was easily defeated. An unplanned armored attack. Scales's soldiers ran up the western bank to seize their section of the 01 line after successfully capturing their initial objective without a struggle. On the way, a big blockhouse 400 yards up the coast called Buster let out a splutter of gunfire, but Marines got near enough to throw grenades at its entrance to quickly put an end to it as well. Captain William Weinstein's Company B moved smoothly forward to join Dillon's men along the crater-pitted runway, where resistance was at best weak, while Scales's men were securing Wendy Point. There were few live Japanese. By 1 p.m., all elements were online and ready to go, but occasionally a few nefarious riflemen who sniped from neighboring trenches and debris. Shrouded culverts needed to be put out with Bangalore torpedoes or satchel charges. Colonel Jones had already landed and established his regimental command post close to the shore by that point. He radioed General Schmidt aboard the USS Appalachian, an amphibious support ship, to express his delight at how simple the operation was. He yelled, "This is a pip!" A few minutes later, he added, "Give us the word and we'll take the rest of the island." General Schmidt told Jones to relax and get ready for the attack's second phase. The commander of Company C, 4th Tank Battalion, Captain Robert Neiman, had no plans to settle down. The flat, open terrain left his M4 mediums exposed and idle, making them easy targets for the many anti-tank guns that are said to be deployed in the area. Neiman gave his troops the order to proceed, preferring action to inaction. Bow gunners mowed down individual Japanese soldiers as the tanks launched, destroying every suspicious structure with their 75mm cannons. The Japanese soldiers fled in terror before the enormous treads. A platoon of AMTanks waddled up the western shore in assistance, and the Marines of Company A pushed forward to offer protection when they saw the tanks plodding across the plain. By 1:30 p.m., 6 M4s were prowling the northern airfield, while several more engaged in combat with enemy machine gunners guarding the Nat Circle runway terminus in the northeast. It appeared as though victory was imminent. General Schmidt, however, disapproved of this unapproved move and gave Jones the order to gather his wildcats in case they were hit by the preliminary bombardment that was planned for the last assault. Before the Mavericks were subdued, an order was restored at the 01 line. Over an hour passed. At 3:15 p.m., Phase 2 was scheduled to begin, with each assault battalion advancing directly up its own half of the island. Secured Roi. The cruiser Santa Fe started firing 5-inch shells into the unruly Nat Circle around 3:10 p.m. With the help of a 75mm half-track fire from the middle of the island, the 2nd Battalion sprang off 20 minutes later. Marines found far more dead Japanese than alive, despite the fact that 20mm fire flickered from Nat Circle. Resistance was, at best, patchy. Captain Neiman's tanks re-engaged the Germans defending Nat Circle, and within 7 minutes, Captain John Padley's Company F was clearing the skeletal hangars along the northern runway. Company E, under by Captain Karl Grusendorf, followed Padley's left. 4 of Grusendorf's Marines fell into a shell hole while advancing, thinking that German men were in a neighboring trench. PFC, not ready to take any unnecessary risks. A grenade had just been pulled by Richard Anderson when it fell out of his hand and rolled to the bottom of their hole. To save his friends, Anderson flung himself on the bomb after realizing his mistake. A posthumous Medal of Honor was given. Hammond's 1st Battalion did not join the advance until 4 p.m., initially staying in place to support Dillon's men with fire. 3 75mm half-track guns followed Captain Fred Eberhardt's new Company C as they charged along the western beach, led by a platoon of light tanks. As a result of the intense naval bombardment, mutilated Japanese corpses were scattered around the area. A small amount of opposition was met with isolated machine gun and rifle fire. Eberhardt's guys were cleaning up Norbert Circle, which is located at the northwest corner of the island, in less than an hour. Nat Circle was all that was left now. One pillbox was still firing machine guns in 3 different directions, despite the fact that Captain Neiman's tanks had destroyed a number of hostile positions. Company G, under Captain Frank Snepp, was Colonel Dillon's reserve, and he was told to knock it out. While a demolition crew closed in for the kill, a half-track pounded its steel door with 75mm rounds. A Bangalore-carrying Marine went up and jammed his torpedo through the crack when someone saw a rent in the roof, while fellows detonated shaped charges at the openings. 3 machine guns and 3 dead gunners were discovered as 6 Marines rushed inside before the dust had settled. They added that the fort's shooting slits faced only north, east, and west, just like many of the island's defenses, which made it much simpler for them to approach the lagoon. All significant resistance on Roi had stopped by 4:45 p.m. At 6:02 p.m., Colonel Jones proclaimed the island secure, despite the fact that the customary mopping up was still in progress. Green Beach won with John Chapin. The fight for Roi had been a pip for the most part, but Namur would be another matter. As they skittered toward the seething cauldron of conflict, the 24th Marines' confused assault waves churned past the rocket-spewing LCIGs 1,000 yards from Namur's beaches. Companies B and D spearheaded the charge with over 3 dozen cannon-wielding AMTanks, and the 1st Armored Amphibian Battalion was instructed to push 100 yards inland upon landing. The whole wave, for some reason, came up 50 yards short of the surf line, where the landing craft was still blasting the invisible adversary. The infantry's Amtraks scooted past the hesitant LVTAs a few minutes later. Company K's 2nd Leonist John Chapin, risking enemy fire, looked over the bow of his vehicle to find his designated landing spot on Green Beach 1. All he saw was dust and raging smoke. His right-hand guy was slumped over dead, his skull smashed to bloody pulp, and he turned to consult his platoon sergeant, uncertain. Chapin looked back to the island in front of him, uneasy. A little before noon, Chapin's own battalion hit Green 1, and a few hundred yards to his right, the amphibious tractors of 2nd Battalion scrambled across Green Beach 2. All arrived with machine guns blazing, planning to unload their Marines 100 yards inland, but they were forced to stop suddenly by a deep anti-tank ditch on Roi. Officers shouted, "Let's leave!" The gunnels were vaulted, as heavily burdened Marines dove 7 feet to the beach below. The covering fire increased to a crescendo. They then scurried a few yards ahead to belly flop, gasping for air before the obstructing ditch. Several boat teams were dispersed by sporadic machine gun fire on Green 1, as Captain Doyle Stout's Company K and Captain Albert Arsenault's company. I disembarked. Chapin asked his battalion guide, who was lying in the sand, if he knew where his troops were. The sergeant's hand broke apart in a shower of blood and bone as soon as he started pointing. With wild eyes, the sergeant clutched his broken stump and screamed, "Sailor! Captain!" Using the modern word for a corpsman after learning that snipers knew what the latter meant and would always go after any medic who rushed to his help. Young Chapin wondered if Namur was going to turn into another Tarawa after losing 2 important subordinates in a short period of time. There was no communication with the assault battalions. When both attack companies' elements landed on Green 2, they also became entangled, but thankfully, there was very little opposition in their sector. Every now and then, a Japanese soldier would leap out of a trench, fire a bullet or two, and then vanish. The gunman was killed by a headlong assault by Marines after they responded with a shower of grenades. When unpredictable machine gun fire swept Company F from a pillbox positioned above Sally Point on the far southeast promontory, the only significant opposition was on the far right. However, this was also quickly put out with the help of the 25th Marines' heavy weapons, which were shooting from nearby Enugarit Island. After swiftly clearing both beaches and pressing quickly interior, the boat and assault teams ran across an unforeseen roadblock. Namur was densely forested, whereas Roi had been open and level to make room for the airfield. The island structures, bunkers, and pillboxes are now hidden from view by the jungle, which is mingled with masses of palm fronds, splintered trunks, and other debris due to the brutal naval bombardment. The Marines moved forward cautiously as a result. A lone defender would occasionally stumble out of hiding, with one or two others in a last-ditch effort to defend his emperor, but they were all killed by a barrage of gunfire. In other places, follow-up forces were left in smaller positions while demolition men were needed to handle recalcitrant pillboxes. In 15 minutes, numerous teams had reached a depth of 200 yards. Brink's 2nd Battalion's left flank broke off communication with Brunelli's 3rd at this point. On Green Beach 2, elements of Company E landed immediately behind Company F, creating this dangerous position. Both companies were caught when they entered the thick undergrowth, with a large portion of Company E inadvertently ending up on the right flank of the battalion, a total reversal of the order of march. Consequently, there was a noticeable void on the battalion's line. Thankfully, by that time, around half of Captain Berkeley's Company G had landed and was sent right away to fill the void. However, these troops only made it 175 yards from the beach before encountering increasingly fierce opposition from lone enemy riflemen and machine guns. The reserve failed to reach either assault battalion, although they did find a missing crew from Company E. The Medal of Honor for Lieutenant John Power. It wasn't just Captain Berkeley's soldiers who were struggling. An assault squad under Chapin and that of Lieutenant John Power met in front of a sizable, fiercely fortified strongpoint made of oil drums filled with sand in the 3rd Battalion area. Every attempt to get around it was met with a barrage of gunfire. To come up with a plan, Chapin and Power huddled behind a concrete wall 25 feet apart, while Chapin and another Marine with a Bangalore torpedo scuttled up to a tiny entrance at the front. Power led 2 automatic riflemen to the rear entrance under intense covering fire. In order to give his friend time to shove the torpedo home, Chapin flipped in a grenade. Just as the entrance crumbled in a puff of dust and smoke, both rolled away. After completing their mission, they promptly joined Lieutenant Power, who had managed to obtain a shaped charge. Power spearheaded the attack this time, and the bunker fell silent as the rear door disappeared in a thunderous roar. At that moment, Chapin saw blood seeping from Power's abdomen, but Power just dismissed it and went back to his unit. Power was confronted with another ominous pillbox shortly after. Power and a demolitions worker sprang forward, pressed their charge against its door, and flinched as the blast tore open a sharp hole, determined to perform what he had done before. Power stuffed his carbine into the ragged slit, emptied its magazine, and pressed one hand against his bleeding stomach. Shots came from within as he stopped to reload. A 3rd bullet tore out Power's throat, and another punched his gut, making him reel. His Marines were furious and hurried ahead to complete the task. Power received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The enemy's resistance remained dispersed and disorganized in spite of these desperate measures. At 12:45 p.m., Company B, led by Captain Milton Coken, struck Green Beach 1 and began mopping up. After that, 3 light tanks from Company B, 4th Tank Battalion, were rendered immobile by shell holes and soft sand. Nearly 300 Japanese rushed from ostensibly empty pillboxes and stormed the tankers as the workers dismounted to release their trucks. The tankers used small arms to cut them down, taking 2 prisoners at the expense of 1 Marine. As his teams dived steadily toward the 01 phase line, which was established at an east-west route nicknamed Sycamore Boulevard, about 2/3 of the way interior, Lieutenant Kohler's Brunelli's battalion moved slowly up the western side of Namur, with one flank hugging the coast. On-site commanders found it challenging to locate this iconic landmark, since like the rest of the island, it was covered with rubble. The entire island has exploded. Intense machine gun fire from a strong blockhouse defending Nut Lane near Nadine Point, halfway up the coast, to the east harassed the right flank of Latin Corps. Brink's haphazard 2nd Battalion. Another big bunker loomed into view less than 200 yards to the left, while other elements pulled up short of Sycamore. Although there was no sign that it was occupied, it was anticipated that any attempt to get around it would be met with counterattacks from any defenders who might be waiting inside or with strong flanking fire. Demolition workers were called in to do their jobs because it would be foolish to ignore it. While Lieutenant Joseph E. Loprede's force from Company E closed in from the right, an assault team from Company F, led by Lieutenant Saul Stein, arrived from the left. Demolition workers cautiously advanced and pressed a shaped charge against the wall of the bunker before retreating. When it detonated, at least 20 people fled into the nearby jungle, perhaps believing they had just escaped a possibly lethal explosion. After the dust had settled, it was clear that the charge had been successful, since a huge hole yawned from the side of the structure. Once more, the sappers advanced, throwing satchel charges into the wide-open mouth. What followed was beyond comprehension. In a single devastating blast, everything in the area disappeared. As though propelled by a volcanic explosion, smoke, fire, and pieces of concrete surged skyward, creating a dark, grit-filled cloud that rose at least 1,000 feet in the air. The severity of the detonation left the Marines who were not killed completely startled and unable to speak. Incoming landing craft were stopped short in the water when concussion waves swept the lagoon, bowling over trees and personnel. After being blasted far out to sea, one Marine from Company F was eventually rescued by the Navy, remarkably unharmed. "The entire damned island has exploded," said an observer in the sky. Every Marine's face on nearby Roi snapped, "Eyes right," at the moment of detonation, with precision on the parade ground. Many thought all the Marines had been dead and Namur completely devastated. Others believed that a 500 or 1,000-pound bomb had been dropped accidentally, or that the Navy had resumed shelling. Subsequent information revealed that the bunker had been used as a munitions storage facility, including at least 100 torpedo warheads that were set off by the satchel charges of the demolition crew. From the epicenter, a thick brown fog spread like something inevitably malevolent across Namur. All of a sudden, nobody could see. Marines' lungs were clogged with bitter fumes, causing them to cough and gag. Some shouted, "Gas!" in fear that the Japanese had attacked with chemicals. Gas, while they urgently looked for safety masks that had previously been thrown away as useless gear. However, the nightmare was far from over. Alongside smaller but equally lethal concrete missiles, shattered tree trunks, and lumber, some of which splashed far out to sea, monolithic slabs of reinforced concrete suddenly came roaring to ground like killer asteroids. The hellish avalanche injured several Marines and crushed at least one. Furthermore, a large number of the stored torpedo warheads fell out of the shadows, some of which detonated when they struck. 2 additional shattering detonations, probably from other bunkers, pounded the front in quick succession. There was anarchy for a while. Approximately 100 Marines were injured and 20 Marines were killed overall. The impact on Captain Garretson's Company F was devastating. 43 people were injured and 14 people, including Lieutenant Stein, were killed. Despite being hurt as well, Lieutenant Colden Brink refused to be evacuated and promptly summoned Company A, his just-landed reserve, to support his beleaguered command. The defenders' unyielding. Although the regiment's momentum was slowed by these morale-depleting incidents, the Japanese appeared to have been encouraged. The boom of Arisaka rifles and the characteristic clatter of Nambu machine guns suddenly filled the front. The war drastically deteriorated from that point on. As the dispersed teams approached on the 01 line, what had once been a constant drive against disjointed and ill-prepared defenders now broke up into an inch-by-inch progression. 3 strategically placed blockhouses fronting the 2nd Battalion sector, one at Nubbin Lane in the center of the island, another at the end of Nut Lane, not far from Nadine Point on the east coast, and a third at a nearby intersection known as Road Junction 58, were responsible for stopping every attempt to cross Sycamore Boulevard by 2:06 p.m. After slowing down, the tempo came to a complete stop. The regimental command post was ashore and was functional by that point. Colonel Hart ordered a general halt to reorganize and reinforce his front after determining that the enemy had recovered from the shocking effects of the naval bombardment. At 4:30 p.m., he gave the order to continue offensive operations. In the meantime, Captain Houston Stiff's Company L, which had finally found enough boats to make the landing, moved up to 3rd Battalion to relieve Company B of its mopping-up duties, allowing that unit to replace battle-weary Company K, which was then sent to Pauline Point, the finger-like sandbar jutting between Roi-Namur, to provide flanking fire for the upcoming attack alongside the regiment's heavier weapons. Captain Irvin Schechter's Company A took over operations on the far right flank, while Captain Horace Parks' recently arrived Company C moved up to relieve the shaken Company E. The front was restructured and ran from left to right as follows. Company L crouched as the 3rd Battalion Reserve, while Company Fowers anchored the western shore adjacent to Company B near the intersection of Sycamore Boulevard and Nasturtium Lane, with Companies F, C, and A extending the front toward Nadine Point. Half of 2nd Battalion's Company G carried the line eastward along Sycamore Boulevard in the middle. Remaining members of Company E stayed on line since they were unaware of their relief. A number of light tanks and LVTAs roared up as the hour of attack approached, and they began firing 37mm shells into the 3 problematic blockhouses that had beset the infantry along Sycamore Boulevard. The guns were unable to break through the dense concrete of the Nut Lane box, which continued to be a thorn in the battalion's side for the remainder of the day, even if those at Nubbin Lane and the road intersection were neutralized. Brunelli's 3rd Battalion attacked at exactly 4:30 p.m., but the Japanese response was so fierce that it left them in disbelief. As Marines ran forward amid exploding mortar rounds, pockets of resistance more than made up for their lack of coordination, with a determination born of desperation, pecking away with machine guns and sniper fire. The advance on the left was understandably slow, and enemy strongpoints were still obscured by the deep terrain. At one point, intense machine gun fire pinned down Corporal Alex Haluchok's Company B squad. Having already been wounded twice, Haluchok ordered his troops to wait while he searched for the gun. He stormed the intimidating weapon, killed its personnel, and led his group to continue, now alone in enemy territory. The Navy Cross was awarded to Haluchok. The 2nd Battalion's attack was postponed for an additional hour due to the confusion caused by the reorganizing on the right. Company B, 4th Tank Battalion's light tanks backed the troops as they crossed Sycamore Boulevard and waded into a jungle that was blazing with small arms fire. As the Army had to search every wrecked building and debris pile, they quickly lost sight of the tanks. As they navigated the jungle-like terrain, the armor pushed forward, shielding one another from canister and machine gun fire. It reached Narcissus Street, 300 yards past the line of departure, in 20 minutes. Here, the road cut southeast toward a junction with Sycamore Boulevard, and a number of tanks turned right and churned down the road. Captain James Denig paused in a clearing to regain his bearings after his command tank fell separated from the others after avoiding one obstacle. 5 Japanese suddenly rushed out of the brush and surrounded his car. The entire crew was wounded, and the compartment was set on fire when one of them mounted the turret and dropped a grenade through a tiny signal port that had been left open for ventilation. PFC, right then? Company A member Howard Smith sliced through the undergrowth and used his bar to spray the tank, killing 4 attackers as a friend killed the 5th. Smith climbed on board the burning vehicle and extracted the fatally injured Denig from the hatch before going back to pull out 2 more, but he was unable to save the driver who had died in the fire. Smith received a Navy Cross for his actions. Only 35 yards from the northern beach, Captain Garretson's ruined Company F eventually made its way through the center and arrived at Narcissus Lane. Garretson was told to retreat 100 yards, where his men kept a bulging salient since he lacked adequate reinforcement. The blockhouse on Nut Lane. On the extreme right, where Company A elements advanced up the eastern shore close to Nadine Point, the situation may have been even more dire. Corporal Arthur Irvin, an irascible and tobacco-chewing former Marine raider, was at the spearhead. He pushed far ahead of the lead scouts, firing round after round at every Japanese soldier he encountered while throwing grenades. Irvin took the lead in the attack when the party encountered the imposing blockhouse at Nut Lane. Irvin was being pursued by First Lieutenant Roy Wood's platoon when they were forced to the ground by intense gunfire. Avoiding bullets, machine gunners George Smith and 18-year-old Steve Hopkins, son of presidential advisor Harry Hopkins, and Lieutenant Phil Wood, not related to Roy, fell into a dugout and set up their Browning. While Wood called for Hopkins to accompany him further down the trench, Smith promptly set to work, adding chaos to chaos. A Japanese corpse that unexpectedly came to life and pulled a grenade was passed by them on the way. When Hopkins pressed the trigger, he was surprised, and his gun was almost touching the soldier's skull. As though in disbelief, the Japanese soldier merely shook his head. Hopkins emptied a full clip into the Superman in shock. "Mr. Wood, did you see?" Hopkins asked astonishedly. "Have you noticed the grenade? Have you noticed what he was going to do?" At that moment, Japanese mortar rounds started to fall close to the dugout. Irvin, unfazed, killed 2 machine gunners while German bullets tore the helmet from his head as he leaped the parapet to perform a one-man reconnaissance of the imposing Nut Lane blockhouse. Irvin returned and presented his report. Lieutenant Phil Wood determined that his platoon's 60mm mortars were the solution, but Marines hurried forward before the weapons could be used because bazooka rounds crashed into the bunker. Irvin and the company's executive officer, Lieutenant Harry Reynolds, arrived first. Both threw grenades through the embrasures until Irvin's abdomen was pierced by gunfire from a nearby dugout, prompting a barrage of profanities. As Sergeant Frank Tucker and Corporal Franklin Robbins sprung up and charged, Lieutenants Reynolds, Wood, and Wood seized a few men and hurried to the offending position, saturating it with rifle fire and grenades. After shooting an enemy rifleman at the dugout's entrance, Tucker and the other soldier ducked inside and fired the entire interior, killing all of the opposing soldiers. The bunker in Nut Lane, meanwhile, started firing again. A dozen Marines crossed Sycamore Boulevard in the hopes of outflanking it, but they were fired upon by a tangle of entrenchments close to the shore. Heavy machine gun fire swept the route, preventing further penetration before others could join them. The isolated squad took matters into their own hands under the leadership of Lieutenants Reynolds and Roy Wood. A tag-along from battalion headquarters, Platoon Sergeant James Adams, attacked the line and shot down a machine gun team before collapsing in a shower of bullets. Corporal Robbins discharged multiple clips nearby, preventing an enemy counterattack on his own before he fell. From behind a fallen log, Reynolds dropped multiple Japanese soldiers until his leg was sliced by a bullet. Down the line, Sergeant Tucker aimed his rifle at dozens of enemy men who were scuttling in the trenches just 15 yards distant, while standing erect behind a broken tree trunk. Bark was torn from Tucker's small shelter by return fire. Tucker continued to fire despite one round piercing his helmet and another draining his canteen. Other Marines saw Tucker's favorable position and started throwing grenades at him, which the sergeant threw into the trench until everyone was weary. Tucker's tree was struck by more gunshots. The sergeant asked for covering fire when he sensed danger. PFCs. Lester Kincaid and Lawrence Knight pounded away with their bars. Knight's cheek was sprayed by a bullet as Tucker fled. Knight re-sighted his gun in anger and continued to fire until Reynolds told him to get help. As the defenders scrambled for cover in another pillbox, the other Marines, their blood up, moved in and forced them from their works, killing at least 30. The Marines who were still separated from their fellows dug in as dusk approached. Banzai! Banzai! By the end of the day, Colonel Hart decided to stop the onslaught and instead dig in, hoping to secure the island the next morning. The few battle veterans considered this foolishness, knowing that the northern beaches were only 200 yards away. These veterans felt the regiment should have continued and completed the task after witnessing the horror of Japanese infiltration methods and the inevitable Banzai onslaught. They dutifully withdrew their entrenching tools and started cutting at the ground, however, for they were Marines. It grew dark. Throughout the night, star shells burst and glistened, illuminating a scene full of torn greenery, decaying bodies, and the battered remnants of the enemy's buildings. Nobody slept. The high-pitched crack of Arisaka guns occasionally came from the sides, front, and back, indicating that the enemy was indeed everywhere. In response, American arms used neon tracers to bind the blackness together. Determined infiltrators occasionally perished at the edges of foxholes that were quickly dug. Young Hoppy Hopkins, who had previously saved his lieutenant's life, was among the Marines who perished. While conducting flank security close to Nadine Point, Hopkins suffered a fatal wound. A rustle in the brush in front of the 3rd Battalion just before dawn made the eyes strain and the heartbeat quicken. As the thrashing increased to a global outcry, trigger fingers stiffened, and then it happened. Banzai! Banzai! In groups of 10 to 20, Japanese soldiers emerged from the brush, shouting frantically and brandishing swords, guns, and bayonets. The Marines threw caution to the wind. The battle turned into a tangle of clubbed rifles, knives, and bayonets as a gap between companies I and B was taken advantage of. The situation was only brought under control by the prompt arrival of Company L and a few medium tanks. The Marines counterattacked, now bolstered. 6 Marines had positioned themselves in a shell hole during the melee when they heard something thump and roll, causing them to get to their feet. After hesitating, Private Richard Sorensen flung himself into the grenade as it exploded. Corpsman James Kirby heard Sorensen's cries while tending to a number of patients in a nearby crater after they had been overrun earlier that evening. Kirby rushed to his help and pulled Sorensen to his makeshift aid station, which was now crammed with 15 injured Marines. Despite suffering severe injuries, Sorensen lived to win the Medal of Honor for saving his friends' lives. Within 35 minutes, the whole thing was finished. Over 100 enemy corpses were scattered in front of Company B's 3rd Platoon, which had all but been destroyed. Lieutenant Colers Brunelli instructed Company K to return to his command from Pauline Point as a preventative measure against such attacks. The final Marine assault. The divisional commander, General Schmidt, had landed the night before and assumed overall command of the operation. He gave the order for a battalion of the 23rd and Captain Neiman's Company C, 4th Tank Battalion, to cross from Roi to Namur in order to strengthen his position. Only 4 tanks had enough ammo and fuel at the moment to complete the journey. These had helped 3rd Battalion stave off the Banzai attack in the early hours of the morning. The remainder of Neiman's force, however, was now armed, fueled, and advancing into position while supplies piled up on both beaches. The 23rd's men were kept on standby. At 9 a.m., the attack will start over again. Reunited with Landing Team 3, Company K would roll along the western coast with 2 platoons of Captain Neiman's medium tanks supporting it and Companies Wine and L deployed to its right. Company B, which Captain Koken had destroyed, was withdrawn as a battalion reserve. When Francis Brink was evacuated due to injuries sustained in the bunker explosion, 1st Battalion Lieutenant Colonel Aquila Dias took over command of the right flank, while Companies F, C, and A pushed his line to the eastern shore. Dias maintained Company G, which was now intact, hooked in with Brunelli's battalion. Company B, 4th Tank Battalion, would reinforce Captain Ross's Company E, which remained in battalion reserve. Brunelli's forces easily overran the remaining enemy troops as the attack got underway on time. His unit arrived at Nora Point, which is located on the northwest corner of the island, in 2 hours. There, it turned right and began sweeping the beaches. Because his armor arrived late, Colonel Dias did not begin until 10:05 a.m., until tanks and half-tracks beat it into surrender. The obstinate Nut Lane blockhouse persisted in resisting every attempt to subdue it. Then things picked up speed. Dias appeared to be everywhere at once, leading others there and urging reluctant Marines here as they sifted through the underbrush of exhausted Japanese. The northern beaches, where 25 to 30 Japanese had gathered in a deep anti-tank ditch, were visible to his Marines by midday. Trouncing up, a battalion of light tanks searched the trough with canister and machine gun fire. A burst of machine gun fire tore through Dias's body as he ran to the edge of the ditch to launch one last attack. The 4th and last posthumous Medal of Honor during the 2-day combat, Dias received it for his dynamic leadership and unwavering bravery. 4 Medals of Honor in the Roi-Namur battle. The Marines found the remaining steadfast defenders around Natalie Point, the island's northernmost peninsula, where the 2 battalions met shortly after midday. The fight for Roi-Namur was over by 2 p.m., and the United States had taken control of the prized airstrip. Many trenches and ditches were filled with mutilated bodies, some 5 deep, and the victorious were horrified by the carnage. The intense naval bombardment claimed the lives of the majority of these. All the trees, shrubs, and buildings were in ruins. Only 92 of the 63 defenders, more than half of them were Korean laborers, were captured. They couldn't resist. The others were too astonished. 190 Marines were killed, and 737 were wounded during the capture of both islands. Who knows how many unseen or unrecorded acts of gallantry were carried out, but the Marines' fortitude is attested by their 17 Navy Crosses and 4 Medals of Honor. It was determined that Operation Flintlock was a complete success. Following Tarawa's brutal lessons, the U.S., with a few adjustments, the plan that the Navy and Marine Corps had developed for future amphibious operations would prove invaluable in later conflicts. The Marshalls were fully conquered, and the groundwork for the attack on the Marianas, from which American bombers could launch assaults on the Japanese mainland, was established with the Army's win at Kwajalein and another Marine victory at Eniwetok later that month. The 4th Marine Division's first combat action was the Battle for Roi-Namur, as they contributed to the destruction of Imperial Japan soldiers on Saipan, Tinian, and eventually the unforgiving misery that was Iwo Jima. The survivors would be fighting other, more brutal wars. However, the Marines of the Fighting Fourth were baptized in fire at Roi-Namur, attacking all the time, never turn around.